So we'll move on now to our next entrant in the facial hair competition. On the right, we have old George Bernard Shaw, who's got an awesome white beard. On the left, we have young George Bernard Shaw, whose neck beard rivals Ibsen, I would say. So here's a guy who's got that penetrating intellectual glance and who is really one of the smartest and most socially and politically proactive thinkers in all of Victorian England. So he wasn't just a playwright. He really, he wrote all kinds of political sort of diatribes and editorials and pamphlets and ideas. And we'll talk about his politics quite a lot because what he's trying to accomplish with a lot of his plays is a pro-socialist mentality. So Shaw doesn't really have an ism. Well, he does. He has we talk about Shavian theater, right? If Cherry Orchard, written by Chekhov, is Chekhovian, then Major Barbara, written by Shaw, is not Shawish, it's called Shavian. So we take that W and change it to a V and add Ian on the end, and it's Shavian. So Shavian theater is generally referred to historically as theater of ideas. And here's what he means by this. Shaw's big idea is that art must serve two ends. Greatness, which means it must be brilliant and hilarious and amazing and entertaining, but it also must serve this idea of social utility. Art must entertain the audience, but it also must try to change the world. And so those are the two things that all of Shaw's plays attempt to boil down to. Whether or not he does it is a different argument. You can argue either way on that, but that's his intention. Theater of ideas is based on the idea that theater should be entertaining and great, and on the other side that it should also be socially proactive, that it should try to change the world. So theater then becomes not just an entertainment, but an intellectual exercise. Shaw believed that his plays should be published and read as well as performed. And frequently they were published on or before the date that they premiered on stage. Because for an intellectual exercise, what Shaw wants you to do is see the play, but also be able to go home and read it again and think about it. So theater should be published and performed, and also theater should be argued about, discussed, explained, and justified. You'll notice in your textbook that what we're not reading is Shaw's very long introduction to Major Barbara, right? I think it's in the neighborhood of 10 full pages of him explaining what his argument is with the play. And that's one of the big keys with Shaw, is that he's a thinker and an intellect, and he wants you to be as thoughtful and intellectual as possible. And he does it by talking and writing a lot. It's a very verbal, word-oriented approach to making an argument. He is, therefore, fundamentally modernist. He believes that the world can be studied and understood, and we can solve problems through studying and understanding the world. Like almost everybody else we read this semester, this notion of modernism, that the world should be examined, studied, and understood in order to make it better. And Shaw's really a quintessential modernist. He is an intellect and a scholar, in addition to being an artist. The big theater of ideas that Shaw writes about, generally speaking, his plays boil down to a conversation on one of these three topics. Frequently a mix of these three topics, right? With Major Barbara, we really get them all: class, gender, and religion. And he has plenty of other things that he writes about, but those three things were the things that sort of interested and troubled him the most in Victorian England. So those are the stories he told. All right, so let's talk about how the Victorians believed, or how the Victorians viewed social class. And I talked a little bit about in the introduction overview to Victorian England, this general notion of societal rigidity. And I just want to sort of give a little bit more detail on that and re-influence it. There is an idea here that class is fundamentally genetic, that it is part of who you are and that you cannot change it, that someone born into the working class has working class genes that lead to working class behavior, which is a little bit more drunken, slovenly, immoral, whatever, right? On the other end of the spectrum, and this is why the Brits are so obsessed with bloodlines and with heritage and with who your mom was and who your dad was, and especially the sort of land-owning upper-class British are obsessed with proper marriages and keeping the bloodlines pure. At the upper end of the spectrum, who you are is genetic, so you are inherently a good person and a noble person and an intelligent person and a person of greatness if you have the right bloodlines. So the idea of class mobility, that you can move from the working to the middle class to the middle class to the upper class, that's a very American idea. The Victorian British just didn't really get that idea at all. It's one of the big cultural divides between England and America, is that across the class spectrum in Victorian England, people just kind of stay where they are. In America, people mostly stay where they are, but they don't believe they have to. So the rigidity of social class is tremendously important. And we'll talk about these three classes, right? We have in Victorian England the aristocracy. And there's a distinction I make there between old and new money. Old money, when we talk about the aristocracy, this is the upper class, right? Old money simply means you got your money by inheriting it from your parents. Your parents inherited it from their parents, inherited it from their parents, inherited it from their parents. These are the 1%, as we sort of see them today, of British society who own and control a massive amount of the economic wealth, land, and political power. So the aristocracy really runs the show. Old money is you're the lord of something, and your dad was the lord of that same place, and you have a giant ownership of territory. Those of you who watch Downton Abbey, this is exactly what we're talking about with the aristocracy, right? New money is less common in Victorian England, but if you were one of those very handful of people who had an idea, was an upstart, and made a lot of money, and did move from the middle class to the upper class, you're seen as new money. Now, in the aristocracy, old money looks down on new money. Because, go back to point number one, if class is genetic, then it isn't just how much money you have, it's who your parents were and that you have that lineage and bloodline. So we see this even today. There's a sort of a societal conflict between old money and new money. But these people run the show. They are dominant in terms of this, they create all of the social conventions. They have this notion of intellectual elitism, that they study the intellectually important and artistic things, and the middle and working class don't really know much about it. The middle class is this white-collar group. And the middle class in England is quite similar to the middle class in America at this time. We're talking about white-collar people who are clerical people, managers, small shop owners, basically people who work with their minds more than their hands. And this group, just like in America, develops the notion of morality as a means to an identity, right? That reserved being reserved and morally sort of refined is a key to who you are as the middle class. The working class is roughly 80% of the population in this era. So a lot of people are still in the working class. We are not at the point where middle class is the dominant majority as we are today. In Victorian England, the working class still makes up most everybody, right? These are manual laborers, roughly 80% of the population. About 30% of them are women who are performing domestic labor, maids, things like that, and factory labor. And they are perceived by the aristocracy and the middle class, they are perceived as rowdy, simple, drunk, questionably moral. All those stereotypes that come along, right? And what's interesting about Victorian England is it's a super, super rigid, stratified, separated class, right? If a person from one of these classes sees a person from another class that they know, they won't talk to him. So imagine like a butler seeing his employer outside of the context of work. They like almost literally wouldn't talk to each other because there is such social separation between the classes. It's super rigid. So one thing I want you to sort of check on as you read Major Barbara is he's got a whole bunch of different class interaction activities here, aspects that go on, right? We have an upper class woman, Major Barbara, interacting with lower class people, which is a rare thing of the day. She's actually out there doing it, right? And so, one of the things we did get in this era with the aristocracy and the middle class, was a desire to help out the poor. But to help out the poor with, like, writing checks and giving money, not actually going onto the front lines and interacting with the poor. Barbara does that in this play, and I want you to see, what's he saying about it? What is Shaw saying about class interaction? It's tremendously important. So, during Victorian England, we get this complexity, as I mentioned, in class interaction. The idea that the upper and middle classes want to help out and be a little bit socially proactive, but they don't want to get their hands dirty, right? The other thing we get during the Victorian era is a clear rise in Marxist and socialist thought. And before we get into that too heavily, I want to make sure that we understand politics and economics. And this is not the most scintillating lecture, but it's tremendously important to understand what Shaw is getting at here. I'm going to talk about the sort of prototypical ideal versions of three economic systems. We're going to talk about capitalism, socialism, and communism. And there was, in the Victorian era, a rise of and move towards socialist thinking to some degree, right? But by and large, Victorian England was a heavily capitalist society. And when we talk about capitalism, this is just general ideological, right? I'm going back to sort of your 8th grade economics class. The driving forces behind capitalism are competition, supply, and demand, right? If I make a car better than the other guy, then my car is going to be worth, and it's going to cost more money. So, and eventually, right, if my car, the car that my company makes is significantly better than the competition, the other guy's actually, the competition is going to go out of business because the consumer decides, well, which one do I want? I want the better car. They're going to pay for mine. The other guy's going to go out of business. Competition is a key aspect to politics, or to the approach of capitalism, as is supply and demand. One of the reasons why rare objects in the world cost more is because of that element of supply and demand, right? If you go out and try to buy a Ferrari versus going out and trying to buy a 10-year-old Chevy, the supply of new Ferraris versus the supply of 10-year-old Chevys is very different. And so there's a much higher demand on Ferraris, therefore they cost a whole lot more. Government in a capitalist mindset has a minimal or absent control. Things like government regulation, government setting prices for things, government controlling who sells what and who buys what. The government is not involved in capitalism, right? Market forces drive everything. And what we get then is, with capitalism, a minimal or absent redistribution of wealth. And what I mean by redistribution of wealth is, well, we do this in America today, right? When we talk about redistribution of wealth, people who make more money are taxed at a higher rate. That money goes back to the government. The government therefore provides tax refunds and other governmental social support for the poor. So the rich have their wealth redistributed to the poor in a very broad sense, right? So in a pure capitalist economics standpoint, and really there aren't many more of these alive in the world today, but pure capitalism says, nope, you keep what you own. You don't really pay taxes, and you don't have to, the government doesn't force you to get rid of your money to take care of other people. You keep the majority of what you earn. Then we have socialism. Socialism is kind of the next step down the road. The driving forces behind socialism are ideology and politics. Socialism essentially as an economic system says the government is and should be heavily involved in economy. Capitalism says government stay out of it, right? So the government has significant control in the socialist idea, and the driving force is ideology. So rather than letting the market decide that a Ferrari should cost more than a Ford or Chevy, in a heavily socialized society, the government might go in and set the price and say, nope, Ferraris cost this much. And we're just going to decide that ideologically the right thing to do is to have cars only ever cost this much, so we don't have this giant gap between the rich and the poor. And then the other thing the socialists do is significantly redistribute wealth. So if you look at a pure capitalist society versus a more socialist society, in a socialist society, taxes, especially taxes on the rich, will be much, much higher. And services and money given to the poor or the working class will be much, much higher. Basically, socialists believe we're going to take some of the money the rich earn away from them and give it back to the poor. We live right now in a society that borders between capitalism and socialism. And there are a million different examples. Europe generally tends to be a little bit more socialist. America generally tends to be a little bit more capitalist, but there are a million different examples, and we can talk about some of these in class. Now, the most extreme version is all the way down the road towards communism or Marxism. And there are very few truly communist governments even around today, but the driving forces of communism are extreme equality and need. So if you jump back up to capitalism, what you own and how much you make in capitalism is theoretically determined by your ability. In communism, what you own and how much you make is determined by what you need, right? So theoretically, in communism, a doctor and a janitor are going to make the same amount of money. If the doctor has 1 kid and the janitor has 7 kids, the janitor is going to make more money than the doctor, theoretically in communism, because the janitor is going to have a higher need, right? He's got 7 kids to feed, so the government sets the price. And we have this government, in a communist sense, total control of the economy, like across the board. And so the government really runs the show and sets the prices and to some degree even determines what job you have. Again, these are extreme examples of communism, right? Wealth therefore is distributed equally. Like I said, everybody makes the same amount regardless of ability, regardless of skill, regardless of what you do. There aren't a lot of pure communist governments in this country or in this world anymore. I don't think there are actually any that ever did it truly that way. And there aren't a lot of pure capitalist governments. So what we have here is a sliding scale, really, between capitalism, socialism, and communism. What I want you to do is think about the way in which these three governmental approaches are viewed and seen and commented on in Major Barbara, because Shaw wants to talk about socialism. That's his big agenda with this play, right? So, Shaw was one of the founders of the Fabian Society. And his agenda with the Fabian Society was the emancipation of land and wealth. The Fabian Society believed that the Earl of whatever, who's had this 60,000 acre plot of land in his family for 3,000 years, or, well, not that long, right? For hundreds and hundreds of years, the Earl of whatever should have that land taken away from him. And because there is no democratic right, says the Fabian Society, that guy should own that much land. It's an unequal distribution of wealth, and we need to fix it, say the Fabians. So we're going to take away that land and wealth, and we're going to redistribute it. It will be managed by the government, or will be managed by the people. And so what we're doing is redistributing land and wealth for general benefits. And then the community, right, through governmental democratic methods, will manage things like those 30,000 acres and all the farms that are on them, or things like Andrew Undershaft's factory. So rather than Undershaft deciding exactly what he's doing with his money, exactly what he's selling and to whom, now we're going to have a democratically elected committee that says, here, we democratically are elected and we run the Undershaft cannon factory. And so we're going to decide. The community will manage industrial capital. The community will decide where the wealth of the nation goes. The important thing about this is really down the road towards socialism and almost communism to some degree, right? The key thing that distinguished the Fabian Society from Marxists and communists is they didn't want a revolution. Right? Marxism, in its purest sense, advocates revolution and overthrow of capitalist governments, as we saw in 1917 in the Soviet Revolution. Right? The Fabian Society says we want to work within the system and gradually progress. We want to get people elected to the House of Parliament who support our views, and then eventually we will enact legislation democratically that changes the way things are. So this is kind of where the Fabian Society is coming from. And here's the question I asked in the previous slide, but let's touch on it again. How does Major Barbara comment on the existing economic structure of England? Is this a pro-socialist or Fabian play? I want you to get deep into the ideas of Andrew Undershaft and his gospel and the things he believes in, and also think about Major Barbara and how did she think the world should be changed. And these two viewpoints are sort of set against each other in the play. And I want you to kind of be able to tell me who you think Shaw favors and why. A couple of other Shavian ideas or approaches when we talk about, so we've talked about really Shaw's agenda. We'll talk a little bit about his style. Shavian realism, his contribution to this approach to realism, is definitely referred to as the problem play. Shaw tends to present us with individual particular social problems. Right? He presents us with, in this play, in Major Barbara, he presents us with the problem of poverty and with the problem of Andrew Undershaft to some degree, right? But primarily the problem of poverty and handouts and charity in the Salvation Army. Stylistically, here's how he does that. He definitely favors dialogue over plot. He doesn't go far down the road as Chekhov to give us plays in which nothing happens, but Shavian characters talk a lot. And they talk intellectually at length about their ideas, and they espouse their viewpoints, and they argue with one another in complex dialogue-based ways, right? And dialogue is much more important to Shaw than plot. Social issues are always at the heart of his plays, right? And so we get this notion that whatever problem he's dealing with, it's going to be one of those social issues. And then here's an interesting term or topic that we can talk about. Shaw tries to render the political in the personal. And we're going to keep on working on this distinction in this class this semester between the personal and the political, right? But what he tries to do is take a political idea and sum it up in one complex, interesting character. So, and I'll just put you on to one, right? The idea of capitalism is rendered in the person, the complex, interesting person of Andrew Undershaft. And Shaw does this in a much more nuanced, realistic, thoughtful way. Because we've seen the political rendered in people before. Remember Uncle Tom's Cabin? When we had evil slave owner, the political existence of the evil slave owner is rendered in Simon Legree. Not very thoughtful. Shaw tends to do this in a much more thoughtful and complex way. So we're getting those big political ideas rendered in people. Shaw also has this deal with idealism versus practicality. He is a huge believer in the practical solutions to things. He has ideas that he holds up very dear, but his ideas are always second to how can we get this done? How can we practically go out and change the world? Rather than just simply sort of spouting off philosophies and ideals, he believes that if you're going to have an idea, it doesn't matter if you have it or not. You got to be practical. You have to have a practical way to execute and enact that idea. So, tell me in discussion in class, how does this theatrical style, this theater of ideas, fit this political agenda that we've talked about? And there are all kinds of different ways, but we'll get into it in class and discuss it. And then, in this continuing discussion of isms, how does Shaw compare to what you've seen from Ibsen and Chekhov? Go back over those poetics elements from Aesthetics 1 and tell me, right, how does Shaw, Ibsen, and Chekhov handle plot, handle character, handle thought, theme, or idea, etc. Because we always want to keep comparing the theatrical style of our newest practitioner to the theatrical styles of the practitioners who came before. So think about Shaw, Ibsen, and Chekhov.